Okay, hello. Welcome, everybody. I'm Michael Rugel from the National Museum of American Jewish Military History, where we tell the stories of Jews going back prior to the American Revolution up through the present day. And today we're going to be focused on the American Revolution. It's a pleasure to be here with Adam Jortner, or author of A Promised Land, Jewish Patriots, the American Revolution, and the Birth of Religious Freedom. Today's program is presented as part of our Alan S. Brown Scholar Series. Alan S. Brown proudly served his country for 23 years as a U.S. naval officer and was a decorated veteran of the Vietnam War. In memory of his dedication to community and education, we present talks from renowned scholars and authors working in the field of American Jewish military history or related disciplines. And it's great to be here today to discuss Jews in the Revolution, a topic that's endlessly fascinating. A lot of interesting Jewish figures, despite the Jews being such a small percentage of the population at the time. And here at the museum, when speaking to visitors, I think the topic of Jews in the Revolution might be the one that people find the most surprising. And our audience is mostly Jewish and people interested in history, but often I've seen the kind of reaction from a visitor that when we get to the Revolution, that they say, oh, I've never really thought of that. And then sometimes you see that temporary pause, and then maybe they have that Sunday school flashback, and they say, "Oh, Haim Solomon." If that's Haim Solomon is the one that people know about. They remember that they heard about in their youth. But I like to speak a lot about how our stories of Jews in the American military defy traditional stereotypes, and we don't exactly get there with Haim Solomon as a Jewish money man. So mostly we focus on the soldiers. And in our core exhibit, Francis Salvador, who was killed in battle, is the one that's represented. And I always like to share the stories of other Jewish officers that served in the army. But it's important to recognize that Jews, despite the small number, serve in all kinds of different capacities in the revolution. And it's great to have Adam's book, which does cover the soldiers, also the financiers, but religious leaders, merchants, all kinds of Jews that played a role in the revolution, and kind of puts it in the context of the American experience as a whole, and that Jewish participation is an important way to view American attitudes towards religious freedom. It's also great to have a book that's written not just from the perspective of someone that does American Jewish history, which a lot of people doing great work in American Jewish history, and I would count myself as someone that comes from the perspective of just American Jewish history, but Adam's books and writings are about Native American religion, Mormonism, all kinds of religion in the 18th and 19th century. So it's great to have him here and bring his perspective. Adam Jortner is the Goodwin Philpott Eminent Professor of Religion in the Department of History at Auburn. He specializes in the history of religion in the American Revolution and the early nation, with particular emphasis on religious liberty, patriotism, and piety, theology, and new religious traditions. He's published the books The Gods of Prophetstown, a study of Native American religion, deism, and military conflict in the Old Northwest, and Blood from the Sky, a history of miracles in the early republic. Gods of Prophetstown won the 2013 James Broussard Prize for the best first book in early American history. And now you can hear his lectures on Audible. So there's a series of his lectures on God and the Founding Fathers on Audible. For those who have questions, you can submit them using the Q&A function on Zoom on the bottom of your screen. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Adam. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Michael, and thanks for being here. It's a real honor to be here. I legacy of Alan Brown is going to be foremost in my thoughts here. Even if if I seem a little flippant about things, I don't mean to be, but sometimes that's the way it has to be when you do religious history, because otherwise it gets too easy to get sort of caught up in oneself. So on the way over, I was born in 1976. And so when I was a kid, I played with G.I. Joes, which some of you will remember. They were little action figures. Remember, action figures, not dolls, because they were for boys. So we played with G.I. Joes, and I wanted, were there any Jewish G.I. Joes? Was not a question I ever asked. I did just check Google along with Michael, and it turns out if you're interested and you're someone of about my age, the G.I. Joe Clutch apparently was Jewish. Real name, Lance Steinberg. But why didn't it ever occur to me that one of these dolls might have been an American Jew? And of course, the answer is the same thing that Michael alluded to when we think about the revolution. It's just not something we associate with American Jews. As the Nobel Prize winning physicist Arno Penzias said when he was growing up in the 30s, it was just taken for granted that Jews did not make good soldiers, that it was not something that Jews were supposed to be doing. And then there's a second level here, thinking about the American Revolution, which is that it is almost always assumed that, quote unquote, everyone in revolutionary America just was Christian. That this is sort of the default setting for every single person in the colonies is, oh, well, they must have been Christian. And if you poke at that a little bit and say, well, why? Well, the answer is usually, well, it was old-timey times. It was old-timey times. And of course, as we all know, America was originally all full of Christians, and Jews only got there later. And of course, that's a myth. This is a myth. It's a myth that Jews did not arrive until the 1870s and 1880s. And it's a myth that everyone in the revolution just simply was Christian. And you're asking me, how do you know this, Dr. Jortner? I know it because we have a letter from the British archives written in July 1776, written in Yiddish from a guy named Jonas Phillips in Philadelphia to some of his friends in the Dutch Netherlands. And Phillips, it is written in July 1776. He has just heard about the Declaration of Independence. He is very excited about it. He is bullish on the revolution. And he writes, the Americans have an army of 100,000 Rukim, he wrote. And Rukim is the Yiddish word for tough guys. And the British actually intercepted this letter while it was on the high seas. And they, of course, had no idea what Yiddish was. They thought it was some sort of code. And that's how it got put into the British archives. Otherwise, we would have lost it. But here is a Patriot letter written in Yiddish. And a few years before that, in 1770, a guy named Bernard Gratz in Pennsylvania writes to a friend, I was going to enclose to you the King's speech to Parliament, but it was such Narishkeit that it's not worth the postage. Narishkeit, Yiddish for foolishness. So again, another Jewish patriot writing in Yiddish. Indeed, at the Battle of Beaufort in South Carolina in 1776, one of the militias was nicknamed the Jew Company because a majority of its members were Jewish. And of course, as some of you may know, and if you don't, you're about to, in May 17th, 1776, Gershom Satius, head of Shearith Israel, New York's only synagogue, organized a day of fasting and prayer as recommended by Congress. Now, this is important. The Continental Congress asked all Christian clergy to hold a day of fasting and prayer. So Satius was under no obligation to have a day of fasting and prayer, but he did it anyway. He led the Jews in worship, asking God to, quote, put it in the heart of our sovereign Lord George III to turn away his fierce wrath from North America. And Satius called upon the God of our fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But other than that, he gave the same prayer as suggested by congressional proclamation. And when the British invaded New York a few months later, Satius took one of the Torahs from the synagogue and led a group of Jewish patriots out of New York and into Connecticut, where there were almost no Jews to speak of, and set up a synagogue in exile rather than live under British rule. In other words, the revolution had rabbis. There were Jewish patriots, not just in the United States in 1776, but actively joined to the Patriot cause, and as we'll see, fighting alongside the army. And I think this idea is important for us. It's knowledge, so of course it's important because it's knowledge. But there are some important contemporary things to take away from this. First of all, thinking about Jews in the revolution, I would say, has something important to say because the revolution is often described as a Christian event or sort of a pseudo-Christian event. Some people have in 2025 have dedicated themselves to the idea that America had a Christian founding, with quotes around that, and therefore Christianity was and is incorporated into American law and policy. It is certainly true that most of the founding fathers and lots of patriots were religious Protestants. But it's not true that Protestant interests and theologies were paramount reasons why people fought the revolution. Because if the revolution was about Christianity, why did Gershom Satius join? And if the Patriot Army was a Christian army, why did they let Jews fight? And of course, the reason is because it wasn't. The American Revolution and the Revolutionary Patriot Army were open to people of all faiths. Some patriots used words like Narishkeit and Rukim. Isaac Frank was a Jew who paraded with his militia to hear the first reading of the Declaration of Independence in Philadelphia. And he therefore pledged with the rest of his troops to defend the same with our lives and fortunes. And part of the problem here is that often this approach to sort of say, did America have a Christian founding? What was the religious founding of America? Limits the idea that sort of says that Protestant interests and theologies were paramount reasons why people fought for the revolution. And then, of course, the corollary is what makes a patriot is Protestant faith. If you have faith, then you have Protestantism. Therefore, if you follow that logic, then of course to be an American is to be a Christian, and Jews, Muslims, Catholics, Sikhs, etc., are later aggregations that can be wiped away. We need another way to discuss religion and the revolution, because again, it's not about a sort of an unchanging American Christianity and sort of a pure Eden of revolutionary America. And the Jewish experience has a lot to offer us here. The Jews are the largest group of white non-Christians in the revolution, and therefore they're a test case. If this was a Christian event, Jews would have been disallowed. But that's not what happened. If this was a Christian event, we would expect pre-revolutionary restrictions on Jews and Jewish practice to continue after the war. That is not what happened. Let me repeat that. The restrictions on Jewish life and practice that are present before the revolution have mostly gone away in the first 2 decades after the revolution. Which means there are 2 things we can definitely say about the revolution. 1, religious diversity is baked into the American founding. And 2, religious freedom comes from the revolution. This is a clear case where religious rights exist afterwards that did not exist before. And this is often news to mainline Christians, secular Americans, evangelical Christians, and even Jews themselves. Sometimes it's just sort of assumed that, Jewish rights just sort of existed. And there are people, there are some historians who make the claim these days that the American Revolution didn't really change anything, that there were not rights were not increased by the revolution. But again, the case of Jewish Americans is a clear-cut case where, in at least one instance, rights do increase. So I want to go ahead and review Jewish participation in the revolution, take a look at how that participation helped create religious freedom in the wake of the revolution. Because whether you agree with my broader points or not, the story is really fascinating. Okay. Let's talk about Jews in the revolution, and particularly this is about national Jewish military history. Let's talk about the army and the militia. As far as we can tell, Jews served in the army and the militias in the same proportion to their number in the general population. So there are 15 Jews who become officers in the revolution. How many total revolutionary officers were there? Well, there were 14,000. Okay, so that number seems small. 14,000 total, and only 15 are Jewish. But Jews are only about 0.1% of the overall American population. And 15 is, get ready, 0.1% of 14,000. Actually, it's a little bit higher. So Jews served as officers in the same proportion as they are in the percentage of the white population. And that's a remarkable number because no Jews at the time had ever been officers in a European army. In every European state, the crown is connected to a church. Maybe that church is Orthodox, maybe that church is Protestant, maybe that church is Catholic, but they're all connected to a church. And therefore, Jews cannot be officers in a Christian army. So there's no Jewish officer, there's no tradition of Jewish military officers in the general population of the United States in 1776. So this is all new, and yet Jews go on to serve as officers in the same percentage as everybody else. Number two, it also means that the Patriot armies recruited and promoted Jews without regard to religious profession, which means that George Washington and the other people in charge of the army were not interested in religious restrictions. Anybody who wanted to show up to fight, they could fight. And that in itself is another really remarkable development because, again, Washington and the Continental Congress are creating this army from nothing. Their models all had religious restrictions. Okay, every European army has religious constraints on who can become an officer. Washington and his army simply say, forget it. Maybe it is because Washington has far-reaching ideas about religious citizenship. Maybe it's because Washington needs every single body he can get. But it doesn't matter why. What matters is the precedence that it sets. Let's have fun. Let's take a look at some of the examples of Jews who fought. One of my favorite guys is Solomon Bush of Philadelphia, who becomes a colonel during the war. He suffers a leg wound at the Battle of Brandywine in 1777, and he can't escape when the British overrun, so he is captured. They send Solomon Bush to Philadelphia, where he sort of is under house arrest, and he sort of sets up shop outside the British commander's house, and he notes who comes and goes, and he sends that information back to General Washington. In other words, he's a spy behind British lines. There was a guy, a private named Elias Pollock. He signed on to a militia unit as Joseph Smith because he was maybe trying to hide his Jewish origins. He didn't know he would get accepted, so he uses a fake name. A guy named Hart Jacobs informs the New York Committee of Safety in 1776 that it is inconsistent with his religious profession to perform military duty on Friday nights, being part of the Jewish Sabbath. The committee then exempted Jacobs from duty on Shabbat, and Jacobs stands guard for the rest of the days of the week. Philip Moses Russell serves with Bush at Brandywine and then becomes a surgeon's mate during the winter at Valley Forge. He survived an attack of camp fever, where he was described as incessantly tending to the wounded and the sick, which eventually impaired his vision as well as his hearing. And Moses Meyer became a major in the Virginia militia, and he finished the war at Yorktown. And these guys are just my favorites. There are a lot of others. What about other leaders? What about people who are didn't serve directly, but didn't serve the armed forces, but served the revolution? Well, there's a guy named Mordecai Sheftall. Mordecai Sheftall became the chairman of what was called the Parochial Committee in Savannah. These committees were sort of spontaneous patriot organizations. And in Savannah, where they kick the British governor out in 1775, British governor, a guy named James Wright, they kick out Wright. The parochial committee kind of takes over, enforces Patriot embargoes, and basically acts like a de facto government, doing, in Sheftall's words, whatever it thought needed doing for Savannah, which essentially means the parochial committee was the de facto government of Savannah. And who is the head of the parochial committee? Why, it's Mordecai Sheftall. Mordecai Sheftall was doing a job he legally could not do under British law. Under Georgia law, everyone who serves in public office has to be Christian. They have to take an oath, not just on the New Testament, but of belief in Jesus Christ. Mordecai Sheftall obviously can't take that oath, so he's kept out of public office. But once they kick the British out, it's a blank slate. And the Patriots had no problem with Sheftall's Jewishness. They give him top job anyway. Again, he wouldn't ordinarily have been able to wield this power under British control, but the new Patriot government, he's allowed to do it. And Governor James Wright, in his letters back to the Crown, notes the presence of one Sheftall, a Jew, as a particularly ominous development in the Georgia colony. Wright was really upset about that. When the British recapture Savannah, Sheftall is captured, and James Wright banned all Jews from the colony. Wright says no more Jews anywhere. And then, of course, Wright claims he's not anti-Semitic. He writes, he just uses the words bigots always use. The times, my lord, require these exertions. It's not my fault I have to ban the Jews. I don't have any choice. Something similar happened in the tiny Caribbean island of St. Eustatius. Now, St. Eustatius it's Dutch. It's not American. But support for the Americans is very strong, particularly among the Jews of St. Eustatius. It's a tiny little island that is basically used as a shipping port. If in 1777, the British seize an illegal cargo off the coast of Maryland. Paperwork aboard indicates that the suppliers of what was in the cargo ship, food, guns, ammunition, were all Jews from St. Eustatius. When St. Eustatius is conquered by the British, Admiral George Rodney invades the island in February 1781. And again, Eustatius has about 60 soldiers. Rodney shows up with 15 warships and 3,000 Marines. So Rodney takes the island without a fight. The objective here to the British is to sabotage the black market trade. Again, there's a black market from Eustatius of supplying the Patriots. Rodney captures the island and then orders all the Jews of St. Eustatius to be rounded up and expelled. His explanation was they cannot be too soon taken care of. They are notorious in the cause of America and France. The Jewish men of St. Eustatia were informed they had 1 day to prepare for exile and could not take any goods or family members with them. British troops collected them in a counting house, stripped them of their clothing, cut up their clothes to see if there were any jewels or money hidden inside. Eventually, 30 of those men were deported to St. Kitts. The rest were released from the warehouse to find their personal goods being auctioned off by British forces. Fun fact, Rodney eventually had to go back to London to face a court-martial for his anti-Semitic prosecution of the Jews. Excuse me. Unplug this. Sorry, everybody. It's an old analog. I silenced my regular phone, but that's my analog phone. Anyway, so fun fact. So Rodney has to go back to London to face a court-martial because of this anti-Semitic capture of the Jews. So he has to face a hearing before Parliament. As a consequence, Rodney is not the man in command of the British fleet when it meets the French fleet in September 1781. They have to have a less seasoned captain leading the British response. The French win handily. The French Navy then sails on to blockade Cornwallis's army at Yorktown, thereby allowing George Washington to trap the British Army against the sea. The future British Prime Minister Lord Shelburne complained at the time that he solemnly believed the capture of Lord Cornwallis was owing to the capture of St. Eustatius. Now, can we definitely say American victory at Yorktown was because of this anti-Semitic action taken by the British Navy? No. But it's very instructive to look at the way the American army treated the Jews and how that resulted in Jews joining the cause, and the way the British Navy treated the Jews in St. Eustatius, which led to their having to have a commander sitting in front of Parliament in London instead of being on the high seas. Finally, I want to tell you about the Jewish synagogue. The Patriot synagogue, I should say. When the American Revolution breaks out, American Jews largely live in 5 cities: Charleston, New York, Philadelphia, Newport, Rhode Island, and Savannah, Georgia. By 1780, all of those cities except Philadelphia were under British control. So Jewish patriots who did not want to live under British rule had really only one place to go, and that was Philadelphia. Unlike Methodists or other forms of Protestants, Jewish worship normally requires certain, for lack of a better term, certain stuff. You need to have a Torah. You need to have a yod. You're supposed to have a minyan. These are things that are, again, not strictly necessary for Jewish worship, but integral to Jewish worship. So if you're a patriot and you're Jewish and you have the means, there's only one town left with a functioning synagogue, and that's Philadelphia. Therefore, from 1779 to 1783, Philadelphia hosted a Jewish community from across the colonies. Jews come from Newport, and Jews come from New York, and Jews come from Savannah, which means they have a group of Jews in Philly that are unified more by political ideology than by common religious liturgy. Because again, the Jews who move are the Patriot Jews. Loyalist Jews stay home. In 1782, Philadelphia's Jewish community refounds its synagogue, Mikveh Israel, with a governing board staffed by Jews from across the nation. The presence of an unabashedly national, patriotic congregation of Jews at the nation's capital, Philly, just a few blocks from Independence Hall, that may explain why the Patriot founding father Benjamin Rush wrote, "The Jews in all the states were patriots." In a very literal organizational sense, American Judaism owes its origins to the revolution. The Patriot Jews work and live together in this single community. They found a synagogue. Again, you get a board governing called an adjunta was the name of it. There's a board that governs the synagogue. When they refounded in 1782, they make sure that there are people on the board who are from all the different Jewish communities. Somebody from New York, somebody from Savannah, somebody from Charleston. There's one guy from New Orleans by way of Havana. But again, it is a national group. It's not the local Philly Jews. It is a national Jewish group. You also have Gershom Satius, who had previously led New York's Patriot Jews out of New York, becomes the Hazan. In lieu of, there are actually no ordained rabbis in North America at the time, so the leader is the Hazan. He becomes the Hazan. He's from New York, and Jonas Phillips becomes the president of the synagogue. And then, of course, they refound the synagogue, and they invite all of the Patriot leaders to come by in 1782 and worship with us. And here's the neat thing. Every American synagogue in the 1790s is being led by someone who was at Mikveh Israel during the American Revolution. In other words, when I say organizationally, American Judaism owes its origins to the revolution, what I mean is literally everybody who came to Mikveh Israel and reorganized that synagogue then went back to their homes and organized new synagogues based on Mikveh Israel's model, based on this idea of a Patriot Jewish organization. So actually, American Judaism is not only present in the American Revolution, Judaism can actually make a pretty good claim to being the first nationally organized religion. Again, that is to say, the first religious group that organized itself along national lines rather than along local or regional or colony lines. Something else important here at Mikveh Israel. In December 1783, the leadership of Mikveh Israel writes to a group called the Pennsylvania Council of Censors. The Council of Censors is the body charged with making revisions to Pennsylvania's constitution. So it has nothing to do with censorship. But anyone who wants to propose amendments to the Pennsylvania state constitution goes to the Council of Censors. A committee at Mikveh Israel meets and asks the censor, they meet, they actually look over this committee of Mikveh Israel looks over every single state constitution, notes what rights Jews do and do not have in each state, and then they write a letter to the Council of Censors of Philadelphia asking the censors to remove the state's test oath. What's a test oath? It's the same thing that kept Mordecai Sheftall from having a political job in Georgia in 1774. A test oath is any kind of oath which requires office holders to be Christians. And of course, Mikveh Israel writes in 1783, explaining themselves this way: the Jews of Charleston, New York, Newport, and other posts occupied by the British troops have distinguishedly suffered for their attachment to the Revolution's principles. The Jews of Pennsylvania can count with any religious society whatsoever, the Whigs, Patriots, among them. They have served, some of them, in the Continental Army. Some went out in the militia to fight the common enemy. All of them have cheerfully contributed to the support of the militia and the government of the state. What I think is important here is not just the fact that American Jews were aware of their disabilities, in this case, an inability to hold public office in Pennsylvania. They were aware of their disabilities, but they also petitioned to have those disabilities removed. Why? Based on their revolutionary experience. It is patriot service that made someone a citizen, not their religious confession. That is certainly the position of Mikveh Israel. We were with you. We were patriots. We served. We should have full rights. And although the Pennsylvania Council of Censors does not act on this petition, by 1790, Pennsylvania's constitution has been amended so that there is no more test oath. And what is fascinating, again, remember, all of the patriots from Mikveh Israel eventually go back home to New York and Rhode Island and South Carolina and Georgia. In every state, by the year 1795, in every state that has a synagogue, test oaths have vanished. Let me repeat that. In every state where there is a synagogue, test oaths go away by 1795. Which is to say, in every state where it would have made a difference, that state, including Georgia and South Carolina, get rid of the need for office holders to take an explicitly Christian oath. Which suggests that the early patriot leadership of the United States agreed with the patriots of Mikveh Israel that citizenship came from service and dedication to the cause and the country, not from religious confession. Indeed, something very interesting happened in the state of Georgia. At the end of the war, there was an effort to remove the test oath in Georgia. This is several years after the war. And as Georgia holds a convention and they're rewriting their constitution, and Mordecai Sheftall is there advocating to get rid of the test oaths, and someone wrote a little pamphlet, published a pamphlet that got circulated to all the members of this revision, this revision committee, the people who are looking at it. Now we have this pamphlet. Pamphlet is called Cursory Remarks on Men and Measures in Georgia. And it's a little pamphlet. It's about 60 pages. It's a series of political complaints sort of packaged around a candy center of anti-Semitism. We don't know who the author was. They are pseudonymous. They call themselves The Citizen. And The Citizen is complaining that Jews would be allowed to be full citizens. And of course, he says things like Jews nowadays enter very little into politics other than to favor the system which is most promotive of their pecuniary interest. The principle of lucre, money, being the life and soul of all their actions. And the pamphlet talks about medieval legends of the blood libel. It argues that English law never allowed Jews to claim rights, and therefore no Jew can become citizens except by the age of the legislature in this Christian country. In other words, the argument is made in this pamphlet. Every single law in Britain still unless it's deliberately revoked by an American legislature, still holds, and Jews never became citizens, so they're not citizens. And it goes on to sort of say that the Jews of Georgia are uppity because they take it upon themselves to volunteer on public occasions. And then finally, the kicker that really makes it sound like it was written yesterday on an alt-right site. The author says he's not prejudiced. I am so far removed from being a friend of persecution as any man on earth. Had the Jews of this state conducted themselves with modesty and decorum, I would have been the last person to point out their disabilities. And he even tells readers about his Jewish friends. He has one whole family of upright demeanor. Well, what's interesting about this pamphlet is not that it gets written, but that it gets replied to by a guy named Levi Sheftall, who's Mordecai's brother. And he just writes a one-paragraph response. It was very simple. Response went like this. The author of this tract subscribes himself a citizen, but what have the Jews done that they should not also be entitled to the gifts of citizenship? And then Levi Sheftall lists the patriotic services Jews had rendered to Georgia, including Mordecai Sheftall's leadership. Mordecai Sheftall had his property seized. The Jewish members of the government in Savannah were imprisoned and discharged the duty and the trust reposed to them. And then Levi says, whether or not such men and the rest of their profession in this state should not have the same rights as everyone else, I leave to the Patriots to judge. And he signs it, a real citizen. What's interesting here is that, of course, Georgia goes with the Sheftalls and not with the author of Men and Measures. They get rid of the test oath. They are perfectly fine bringing Jews into the political community as full members. And I think it's interesting to note that what the Sheftalls have done is to point out that, again, they've been made citizens by what they do. It's what you do that counts. Whereas this pamphlet, Men and Measures, follows an old anti-Semitic standby. Membership and personhood in the state comes from some form of religious confession, and Jews can simply never have it. Two very different ideas of what citizenship is. Does citizenship come from your participation in the state, your service in the state, your actions? Or is citizenship merely a birthright and or based on confessional identification? You go to a church and therefore you are a citizen, full stop, and no one can earn it. Interesting. The most famous statement on Jewish rights in the early United States follows the first way of thinking, the Sheftal's line of thinking, Mikveh Israel line of thinking. And I have, of course, talking about George Washington's 1790 letter to the Hebrew congregation of Newport. Washington writes this letter in 1790. He was addressing a letter he had received from Moses Seixas at the Newport synagogue. Moses Seixas, when Rhode Island finally joins the Union, writes to Washington, and he mentions Jewish disabilities, deprived as we heretofore have been of the invaluable rights of citizenship. Again, Moses Seixas is not talking about long Jewish history. He's talking about Rhode Island, where there had been attempts in the 18th century to seize Jewish property, where Jews are not allowed to vote. Washington replies to Seixas this way. He praises the Newport synagogue, and he writes, "All alike possess liberty of conscience, liberty of conscience, and the immunities of citizenship. It is now no more that toleration is spoken of, as if it was by the indulgence of one class of people that another enjoyed the exercise of their inherent natural rights." And so, again, Washington follows the argument of Seixas, the argument of Sheftal, the argument of Mikveh Israel. It is what you do. It is how you conduct yourself that determines citizenship, not where one prays. And so we actually do have an answer to this interesting question that I brought up at the very beginning of my talk. Were the people of the revolution, the founders, the founding fathers, interested in making a republic that is bound by confession, by Christian oaths? Or is it a republic where one's loyalty to country is not bound by religious opinions? And for Washington in 1790, the answer is the latter. It is not a question of toleration, but of full citizenship. Citizenship is in some way achieved through participation in the revolution. And this is an idea that does not just come up once or twice, but over and over and over again. Our national discussion will not likely be transformed by the research that I've done, but I do hope that people who hear what I have to say and read the book will have a chance of altering that discussion a little bit by helping people to recognize and think about Jewish patriots. And I will tell you from experience, there are two, in this, again, small sample size theater, just in my own experience, two groups of people have been very interested in finding out more about the Jewish patriots. One is Jews, which we might expect, and the other has been evangelical Christians. Have been extremely interested. They want to hear more about these non-Christians who were there at the American founding because they had never heard of them. And so I think that this is an important object to bring up here, not just to sort of say, well, Jews were there too, but because Jewish participation in the revolution raises this question of what kind of a republic, religiously speaking, is this supposed to be? And how does the treatment of Jews affect the way the Patriots saw the republic in a religious sense? And Jews didn't do it by themselves. There are Baptists who are working on this, Catholics who are pushing for full rights, Presbyterians pushing for full rights, Quakers pushing for full rights. And so, if I may, I think it may be useful for us to, when looking at this question, to wildly paraphrase Lenny Bruce. It behooves us to think about, how, in some ways, in this question, Catholics are Jewish, Baptists are Jewish, Presbyterians are Jewish, and Quakers are Jewish. Indeed, we may all just be just a little bit Jewish. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Jortner. That Lenny Bruce Jewish versus Goyish is one of my favorite bits from any comedian ever. So that's great to hear. Yeah, we got a fair number of questions. We talked about Jewish patriots. There's a couple questions about Jewish loyalists. Jonathan Newmark and Gary Ginsberg. I'll read Jonathan Newmark's. How many Jews living in the states at the time of independence had supported the loyalist cause? Did many of them emigrate to Canada with the loyalist exodus, or did they remain in the United States? If they stayed, how did the Patriot Jews treat them? Did you come across many stories of loyalists in your research?
Great question. So what about the Jewish loyalists? In terms of, I don't have an actual, I can't give you actual numbers. And the reality is, before the creation of the U.S. Census, and even after the U.S. Census, hard numbers are pretty squishy. But overall, I found much more evidence of Jewish patriots than Jewish loyalism. We know there were Jewish loyalists because there is a group. The synagogue in Shearith, Israel, in New York, stays open. The synagogue in Newport stays open, but they only have like 6 guys showing up in Newport. Or let me be a little bit clearer when I say about 6 guys. The person who is supervising the synagogue is left just a couple of notes, and at one point he says only 6 people showed up for worship today. Overall, it does appear that more Jews were patriots than were loyalists. Again, we don't have hard numbers to necessarily back that up, but in terms of what I came across, that's what I found. Some of them go to Canada. A couple of them go to Britain, and some stick around. And interestingly, it's Shearith, Israel. When the British occupy New York, they actually pick a guy named Abram Zuntz. And Zuntz is a Jewish Hessian from Germany who is a supplier for Hessian troops. And they make him the president of the synagogue. And when the Jews return, when the British leave New York, the new synagogue, the new Shearith Israel, actually asks Zuntz to be on the board. They invite him to stay, even though he is a loyalist. They invite him to stay on the board, which indicates at least a little bit that the Jewish patriots have an interest in not perpetuating the political feud, to sort of bring this group into, if they want to be part of the synagogue, they want to bring them into the synagogue.
Thanks, you. I was curious and kind of to do more research on about the Lushington's Jew company. Did you get any sense of, since it wasn't entirely Jews, was that term applied with maybe a little bit of derision? Was it a honor? Where do you think that came from, them being referred to as the Jew company?
So there is this militia company in South Carolina from the town of Lushington, and it is called the guy who's running it is Lushington. It's a militia. It's got 40 members. It's called the Jew Company. A lot of what we know about them comes from one guy's memorial of it. And one of the things he says is they were called the Jew Company, but they called themselves the Free Citizens, which is very interesting to sort of think about. Okay, how were they being labeled, and what did they think of themselves as? We're not the Jews, we're citizens. Was it a term of derision? Possibly. There is some indication. This is very squishy stuff, folks. But in the 18th century, most Jews, the polite word to refer to someone who was Jewish would be as an Israelite. And Jew was a less appropriate term. So could it have been applied and picked up by the Jew Company as like, yeah, we are the Jew Company? I certainly think that's possible. But again, it's a majority Jewish company.
A couple questions about a slightly the earlier period. A comment from Robin Gottlieb. I had the good fortune of seeing the Flushing Remonstrance seeking religious freedom as early as 1657. And then Ira Crefting says, please explain the Toleration Act and discuss if the Toleration Act applied to Jews. You did a little bit of the lead up to the revolution with these things. Can you address some of the earlier period?
Yeah, you'll notice I skipped the I did skip the pre-revolutionary period, because if you're doing the revolution, you got to get into the revolution just as quick as you can. And I did that whole thing with the GI Joes. I'm going to click on the chat to see I'm not sure which Toleration Act we're talking about, but let me sort of I'll do a little sketch out of sort of what I do now. And if you have more specific questions, we can have a follow up. So Jews are officially kicked out of. Jews are not allowed in France, Spain, and England in the 1600s. England allows them to be back in, but they are not subjects. In other words, Jews are allowed to live in England, but they are not subjects of the crown. They are foreign residents. That same law is, generally speaking, applied in the British colonies, although inconsistently. So that when the first Jew, famously 1654, a group of Jews escaping from Dutch Brazil end up at the island of Manhattan, and Governor Stuyvesant tries to kick them out because they're not citizens. It depends on where you are. New York does seem to have some Jews actually voting in the 1730s, but the reason we know that is because there was a contested election where somebody said, "Hey, did you know that Jews are voting in this election?" And that was there was a big to do about it. And from that, it was determined that some Jews had actually voted, and then they were like, "Well, we can't have this happen again." In general, again, in the British colonies, Jews do not have full rights. Some of them occasionally become noted as subjects, but every single person who is officially given recognition as a subject of King George goes through an enormous amount of rigmarole. One of the guys gets it, and then later somebody says, "But there was a note taken, was like, you shouldn't have gotten this because you're Jewish." And as far as the French colonies goes, no Jews are supposed to be in French colonies. There's a thing called the Code Noir in French colonies, which predominantly applies to enslaved populations. But one of the caveats there is no Jews shall settle in any French colony. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it sort of gives you a perspective. If this question is, are things better for Jews in British North America than in the Russian Pale of Settlement? The answer is yes. But they do not have full rights, and it doesn't really look like they're heading towards full rights at the time of the revolution. Indeed, at the time, it is sort of the Dutch colonies in the Caribbean that really look like they're going to become the centers of Jewish life.
So let's jump to after the revolution. Sheldon Goldberg has a question about test oaths. Didn't they remain in Maryland until the Jew bill was passed in 1826? So that you were making the distinction between places that had synagogues and those that did not?
Yep. Every place that has a synagogue in 1795 has gotten rid of its test oath. So that is, by 1795, that is Rhode Island, New York, Pennsylvania, Virginia, South Carolina, and Georgia. Other places sort of hang on to their test oath. And I think this is important because in that there's that first 20 years of post-revolutionary sort of fervor. Everywhere that Jews live, they are granted full citizenship rights. In places where they do not, those laws stay on the books. And this gets a little squishy, but I hope you'll sort of stick with me. In the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, when Jews in places like North Carolina and Maryland attempt to hold public office, then there is an uproar. It is at that point when people start talking about, well, this was founded as a Christian nation. And it's very important when we sort of hear the arguments about Christian nationhood in the 21st century, it's just important to note, a lot of the people who said those things weren't themselves in the revolution. They're living a generation or two afterwards. So there's a process by the 1830s and 1840s that sort of begins to sort of Christianize the revolution a little bit more. And indeed, when Maryland Jews petitioned to have that ban, the test oath, removed in Maryland, there's a huge kerfluffle. And they call it the Jew Bill. And there's actually a political ticket called the No Jew Bill ticket. That's also in the book. That is 40 years after the revolution. Again, the idea that religious rights are always going to go in a straight path is not true. There's this big outbreak of religious freedom right after the revolution, and then there are efforts to temper that.
A couple specific questions here. Lewis Stone, I live in Morristown, New Jersey. The Continental Army spent 2 winters here, only one in Valley Forge. How can I find out if there were Jewish soldiers here during those winters? You know anything specifically about Morristown or research tips?
There is a book by a guy. There's a book called Unrecognized Patriots.
Yeah, Resnick, I believe.
Yeah, by Marcus Resnick. Reszick, I believe, has a lot of data on Jews in the revolution. The challenge, though, the good thing for religious freedom, and I'm very pro religious freedom, just to be so we're all clear here about my own biases. I'm pro religious freedom. The good thing for religious freedom is the army doesn't take the religious data of its members. The bad thing for the historian is that the army doesn't take the religious data of its members. So it's hard to sort of know, okay, were any of these guys Jewish? And you sort of have to go through, one way to do it is to sort of go through any kind of paperwork that the officers left, which is how found out things about the guy who says, well, I can't serve on Friday nights because it's my Sabbath. Those little bits and pieces can sometimes be found.
Okay, I think we got time for one more. Harvey Weiner asked about the Jonas Phillips letter you quoted, that you referred to. Where did the Yiddish you quoted come from? I thought that Ladino would be the language of Newport Savannah. Was Philadelphia different? Where did they come from? And maybe you could just speak very generally on Sephardic versus Ashkenazi roots of the Jews of this period.
Sure. They're really from all over. So great question. Jonas Phillips is Ashkenazi, and it's probably the case that most Jews in the United States in this period were of Sephardic origin, but by the end of the 18th century, that has significantly changed, and Ashkenazic Jews are coming in, particularly from Britain. 2 points to make. One is, again, just because it's majority Sephardic doesn't mean that there aren't Ashkenazic Jews talking in Yiddish, but great point. And the second thing I sort of point out is one of the reasons we point to that is because often the liturgy is the Sephardic liturgy. There are a couple of cases in the 1750s and 1760s where synagogues are arguing over, do we switch to a Ashkenazic model for the worship service? And by and large, they don't. Even though more people are coming in who are used to the Ashkenazic model, they stick with the Sephardic model. And actually, after the revolution, a number of these synagogues start having the same argument. And then some people sort of say, well, we should have an American model. And then they just make up something. They don't make it up out of whole cloth, but it does allow them to not have to pick and choose. They just sort of do their own thing. Again, an interesting way in which the revolution shapes the religion.
Yeah, and we can end with just one final comment from Matthew Millen. G.I. Joe is a product of Hasbro Toys, short for Hassenfield Brothers, 2 Jews from Providence, Rhode Island. My mother and the Hassensfields were neighbors in the 1930s. Thanks, Matt.
Yeah.
So get back to the important stuff with the G.I. Joes.
Well, hey, look, it's also G.I. Joes don't take the religious data of their members either. And that might be useful because when we should have very inclusive armed forces, but it's the soldier that matters. But thank you. That is great to know.
Yeah, so we can end on that note. Did you have any final thoughts before we sign off, Dr. Jortner?
I don't. Thank you all for coming. I really, really appreciate it.
All right, thanks everybody. So we did record this. Hopefully we should have a recording available pretty soon. Thanks to everyone for being on.